As you might have guessed from the channel's name, we like wrestling with tough, philosophical questions down here in Mother's Basement. Questions like, is Avatar anime? How much of the live-action Avatar movie can you watch before you irreparably damage your soul? And can I induce an existential crisis by talking about Goku? In every one of those cases, the answer was yes. But today, we're going to tackle one of the most contentious and challenging questions we've ever had to face as anime fans. Does time travel count as Isekai? And if so, how much? First, though, we're gonna take a minute to get hyped for today's sponsor, the newest game out of the Hoyoverse, Honkai Star Rail. A stunning new anime-style RPG, free-to-play cross-platform on mobile and PC, which has finally announced its release date, April 25th in North America. Honkai Star Rail invites you aboard the Astral Express for an epic and immersive planet-hopping adventure across a massive science fantasy universe. Through free-roaming exploration gameplay and gorgeously directed cutscenes, you'll meet dozens of delightful and quirky characters on an array of fantastical planetscapes, all crafted by the same team of artists who brought you the breathtaking Genshin Impact, and maybe even saved the universe itself along the way, with plenty of side stories and vast, rich veins of lore to dig into at every stop throughout your journey. The game sounds as beautiful as it looks, too, with powerful music and 4 different languages worth of star-studded voice casts bringing its sprawling story to life. Combine all that with a bombastic new turn-based battle system that lets you drop entire armies and even orbital lasers on your foes, and you've got a game that's a feast for all the senses, including your tactical ones. Click the link below to learn more about Honkai Star Rail and join the 6.5 million gamers who've already pre-registered for their tickets to the Astral Express. With that said, it's time to get on with the question, and I know full well that for many of you, the knee-jerk answer to it will be a simple and succinct no. Isekai means other world, after all, and time travelers just go to the same world at a different time. It is right there in their name. However, an isekai protagonist doesn't actually have to leave their reality for the anime they're in to be isekai. SAO is considered a foundational work of the genre, after all, and Kirito's just plugged into a simulation in his bedroom or a hospital the whole time. The isekai arc of Hunter x Hunter, Greed Island, blurs the line even further when what seems at first to be a simulated world is revealed to be something a little more interesting that I won't spoil, but there's still plenty of debate as to if it counts, and personally, I think it does. I mean, the heroes end up in a setting that runs on totally different rules from what they're used to. They're stuck there at first and have to figure those rules out before they can find their way out. Those rules are explicitly video gamey, much like 90% of isekai, and one could even argue that Gon was predestined for, again, reasons I won't spoil, to be the one who finally tips the balance and clears the game. Coming at the issue from the opposite angle, anyone who remembers a time before 2001 can tell you how different a world can become in just a handful of decades, let alone centuries or millennia. So, with a time leap large enough, it's fair to say the experience is almost indistinguishable from isekai. Completely indistinguishable in the case of Inuyasha, where traipsing back to the Sengoku era places Kagome in a world ruled by magic and monsters that time forgot. She even awakens to her own super special magic powers and a demon-fighting destiny upon arrival, and ends up enslaving a fuckable half-animal person within hours of starting her adventure. The only way it could be more isekai is if she landed herself a harem, and I can totally understand that Rumiko Takahashi was a little tired of those after inventing them with her last manga. And even without that element, the case for it counting as isekai is basically airtight. If a new anime fan who really enjoyed Escaflowne and Fushigi Yugi asked you what they should watch next, 10 out of 10 times you'd say Inuyasha, and 10 out of 10 times they would thank you for it. Now, to be fair, all the magic and demons in Inuyasha's medieval setting obviously contribute quite a lot to its overall feeling of isekai-ness, same as they do for the best isekai, army of darkness. But can we really say the same logic applies to more relatively grounded stories about modern people finding themselves in feudal Japan, like Nobunaga Concerto, The Ambition of Oda Nobunaga, or Battle Girl's Time Paradox? Well, Concerto's history-slackened protagonist certainly fits both the fish out of water and destined hero tropes so typical of isekai to a T, and he gets his fair share of waifu and wish fulfillment in his life as a feudal lord. He even has a cheat item in the form of his history textbook, though to be fair, that is only useful to him because he's still in basically the same world. The fact that he's traveled through time and thus possesses foreknowledge of coming events is much more relevant to his story than that of Kagome Higurashi or Ashley Williams. In a lot of ways, Saburo's situation's more comparable to a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. Did I just say Yankee? Oh my god, anime has poisoned my brain. But then, many would point to that very novel as an essential work of proto-isekai fiction, so I'd say it's complicated. As for those other two anime I mentioned, though, their situation's surprisingly cut and dry. If I had a nickel for every time a Sengoku-era anime has been set in a parallel world solely to justify turning all the warriors of Oda Nobunaga's court into hot girls, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice. Also convenient for my argument, since not even the stickiest of sticklers would deny that either one of those is isekai. Thus, I see little reason not to count Nobunaga Concerto in the isekai canon. And by the same token, tales of historical figures being thrust into the present, like ya boy Kong Ming and Thermae Romai, can be considered reverse isekai. Hell, Shibuya at Halloween. I'd argue Kong Ming did a better job of scratching my "the devil is a part-timer" itch than "the devil is a part-timer" season 2. It's in looking to the future, though, that I think I can make the strongest case that non-magical time travel stories should count as isekai. Sufficiently advanced technology is, after all, indistinguishable from magic. And even when the tech's not quite sufficiently advanced, like in Buddy Complex, which yoinks its contemporary hero 74 years forward to a world of mech warfare, it can still be advanced enough to fundamentally change everything about how the world works. You could easily describe that show as a kid gets isekai'd into Walmart Gundam and get little pushback for it. That's definitely a debatable example, though. Now and then, here and there, probably the single darkest isekai I've ever seen, is quite a bit more definitive. Its upbeat shonen hero, Shu Matsutani, spends much of the story believing that the world he gets dropped into, a blighted wasteland ruled over by a mad dictator and his army of child soldiers, is a parallel world of some sort, thanks to its strange geography, alien cultures, and fantastical tech. But toward the end, he's horrified to learn that it's actually a war-ravaged Earth, thousands of years in the future. That twist simply wouldn't work if portal fantasies and time travel stories weren't so fundamentally close in both concept and execution. And it's clear proof that with enough distance from present context, time alone can turn this world into something wholly other. Time travel can be isekai, and so theoretically could Rip Van Winkle stories like Seven Seeds, Zombieland Saga, or Dr. Stone. Though with the zombies, I'd argue that only some of them count as having been isekai'd based on, how long ago they died, although the most recent one did get hit by a truck, and in the latter case, I'd argue the many points of continuity between old Earth and new that are revealed as the story goes on, not to mention the many old conflicts that get revived along with the people of old Earth, put Dr. Stone in a category all its own. It's certainly got some isekai appeal, comparable in many ways to Ascendance of a Bookworm, but it's more of a Lord of the Flies type survival scenario on a global scale, with the petrification event taking the place of a boat crash. Kinda like what horror manga classic The Drifting Classroom does with its mysterious time slip event, now that I think of it. And I wouldn't really call that isekai either. In both cases, I think the characters just bring too much of their old world with them into the future. Now, that is also essentially what Sunny Boy does with its dimension hopping concept, but that series fits more comfortably into the isekai conversation with its commentary on escapism and growing up. It pulls the characters out of their ordinary world and into something decidedly different, albeit something they and their peers help shape. With all that said, it logically follows that the inverse must be true as well, that a time leap or loop that's small enough for the hero to still find their surroundings familiar shouldn't count as isekai. And indeed, it's self-evidently silly to slap the isekai label on any time travel anime where the time traveled can be measured in days, like Sagrada Reset, Summertime Rendering, or ReZero. Well, okay, that last one's kind of a bad example, but you get what I mean. And obviously, the same is true if the characters only go back a handful of weeks or months, or even a couple years. Nobody would seriously argue that Higurashi or Link Click should count as isekai. But that begs the question, where exactly is the line? How big does the difference between time periods need to be before we move into isekai territory? Remake Our Life sends its hero back 10 years to a world where the internet's slightly slower and phones exponentially crappier to give him a second chance at living his artistic dreams. And while Kyoya's trip to the past does leave him with a whole mess of wishes fulfilled and a harem's worth of hotties attracted, the kind of life he was living doesn't really change on any fundamental level. It just gets better the second time around. The gap between times is certainly big enough that he needs to do some adjusting when he arrives, but no more than would be required of someone who just moved countries, or heck, even provinces. All right, some of you are American. Those are kind of like states, only more, provincial? Anyway, Kyoya's less a fish out of water than a fish in a fancier aquarium. If we start calling that isekai, we may as well call Wolf Children isekai, and that's a slope I really don't want to slip down. But then, when I look at two series that extend the gap by just a couple years, suddenly I'm not so sure anymore. Occult Academy, set in 1999, follows a character who was sent from the apocalyptic future to 2012 to stop the apocalypse from happening, and going from a world where civilization doesn't exist to one where it does definitely would induce enough culture shock to qualify as reverse isekai. But of course, that's a very specific scenario that only really applies to that anime and Terminator franchise, and it's about as far from Remake Our Lives as you can get. Tokyo Revengers is a much better point of comparison, and it may only span 12 years compared to Remake's 10, but the leap from soul-crushing convenience store work to teenage delinquency is a whole lot bigger than the one from crunching at a game studio to crunching at an art school. Takemichi is forced to change his whole way of life to adapt to the new world of gang violence he finds himself thrust into, and that world certainly plays by different rules than the society he's used to. And dangerous as it is, there's also an unquestionable escapist appeal to overcoming his fears and diving into and thriving in that world. On the other hand, though, his actions in the past do continually have repercussions on his future. The whole reason he keeps going back is to save the woman he loves, and it takes a lot of tries to get that right. He can't ever afford to truly lose himself in the past or forget the needs of his present self, so the series kind of straddles a line, as does Erased. Satoru has to navigate and blend into the world of late 80s childhood with the mindset of a depressed mid-2000s adult, which is obviously a huge change, but any fleeting moment of joyful nostalgia he might experience there can be ripped away by the killer at any second, so he can't really relax and enjoy it. Now, what's interesting there is that in order to stop the killer, Satoru ultimately needs to put faith in his friends and learn to think more like a kid again, essentially sacrificing the adult that he was to secure a future for everyone he loves, which definitely fits into the thematic conversation around isekai and escapism, though maybe as a sidebar. Together, though, I think Erased and Revengers demonstrate that the gap between adulthood and and childhood can be big enough in itself to create essentially an isekai experience, though both do feature enough interaction with the present to muddy those waters. But then those waters can be muddied even when the time gap is enough to separate whole generations. Zapang follows the crew of a modern Japanese battleship who've been sent back in time to the Second World War and are forced to choose between using their incredible technological advantage to save the lives of their past countrymen or letting history take its course and Japan lose the war to preserve the democratic way of life they know. It's a story deeply concerned with the ramifications the past can have on the present and with examining Japan's bloody history through a modern lens. And I don't think any of that really fits with the escapist detachment of isekai, even though it does cover a span of 60 years, which is similar to the time leaped by the protagonists of Buddy Complex and Iroduku World in Colors, about 70 years, and I'd almost certainly classify both of those as isekai and reverse isekai, respectively. Of course, no discussion of time travel anime would be complete without Steins Gate, whose actual minute-to-minute plot doesn't really span that much time at all, but its parallel timeline hopping conceit does make this whole discussion exponentially more complicated. Early on, the timelines Okabe finds himself in are similar enough to each other that calling them isekai would just be ludicrous, but after he causes the world line to diverge so severely that Akihabara itself ceases to exist, I mean, that does put him personally about as far out of water as a fish can get, but then that's a product of altering, not directly traveling to the past, and other world lines cease to exist when a new one is activated, so scientifically speaking, there's only ever the one world that they're in, and my head's starting to hurt, but my gut says it isn't really isekai. Ultimately, I think the answer to this question doesn't just lie in the conceptual difference between the times being traveled to in a given anime, but also how time itself plays a role in the story, both in terms of plot and theme. If it's about changing the present or future in some way, then it's more of a time travel type thing. Whereas if it's just about going on an adventure in an unfamiliar setting, I'm comfortable calling it isekai. Okay, so now that we've reached this conclusion, what does it do for us? Well, with Occult Academy and Erased firmly in the at least kinda isekai bucket, that means all I've got to do is convince you that Silver Spoon is an isekai, and suddenly the genre accounts for most of Tomohiko Ito's career. It also means that I've got several more animes worth of work ahead of me when I follow my career to its logical endpoint and review every isekai in existence in one giant stunt video. So, thanks for that, me. But as for you guys, what I hope you'll take away from this is that genre isn't fixed in stone. It's a malleable, subjective concept, molded by narrative experience and open to audience interpretation. Genre is a tool that helps us understand and categorize the shape of stories, and we can learn new things about the stories we love and storytelling as a whole by applying it where it may not seem at first to belong, becoming better readers and better writers in the process. I'm Geoff Thew, professional isekaiologist, and I'll see you next week for that lecture on Silver Spoon. Just kidding. Next week is going to be the long-awaited cult anime Part 3 featuring the ghost of Stan Lee. Please look forward to it. Onegai shimasu.